Hello and welcome to the Attenborough Studio. My name's Alison. I'm your host for today's Nature Live event. Now, can I ask you to put up your hand if you've never been to a Nature Live before? Oh, lots of you, most of you in fact. That's excellent. Well, for those of you that don't know, Nature Live is an event that happens every Friday, Saturday and Sunday here at the museum. And it's really a chance for you guys to get a peek behind the scenes at the museum and find out some of the fascinating work that goes on here. Because we are not just a museum, we are an active centre for scientific research. We hold, at last count, around 80 million specimens here at the museum, which is a mind-boggling number. And we have around 350 scientists and researchers that work behind the scenes on those collections, preserving them, conserving them, but also studying them as well to answer some really important questions about the world that we live in. So Nature Live is your chance to meet one of our scientists and to find out a little bit about what they've been up to. Now, it's a very informal event. We do encourage questions from our audience, so if you do have a question at any point, don't be shy. Raise your hand and I'll come to you with the mic so we can all hear you. Now, we're joined today by Max from our Department of Life Sciences. Welcome, Max. Thank you for coming down today.
Thank you, Alison.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about what you do at the museum?
Yes, well, I manage the beetle collections here, and I brought a few drawers of beetles along to show you, which you'll be able to come and have a look at later. But in the collection, we have 22,000 drawers like this. We have one of the largest and oldest collections of this kind anywhere in the world. And of course, beetles are a group of insects, but they are the largest group of insects. There are, so far named by scientists, 400,000 different kinds of beetle. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the collections of beetles that we have here at the museum.
Now, Max, can you tell us what the defining characteristics of a beetle are? How can you tell a beetle from another type of insect?
Yes, let's get a picture of a beetle up here. Got some, those gold ones will do, number 4, that'll be perfect. So there's a couple of fairly jazzy looking beetles. But as you can see, they've got 6 legs, which makes them an insect. And they have, though you can't really see it in those pictures, they also have 4 wings. And here's one flying that you can see. This is a Goliath beetle from Central Africa with its wings open. And almost all beetles can fly. But the distinctive thing about beetles is that the front pair of wings are hard and shelly and protect the back pair of wings, which are used for flying. So if you're a butterfly, you have 4 flying wings, and you're very mobile, but you're not very well protected. If you're a snail or a woodlouse, you've got a hard shell, and you're well protected, but you're not very mobile. And with the beetles, they have the best of both worlds. They have this hard shell, and they can open it up, and they've got the wings underneath. So if they want to be protected, they can be protected. If they want to fly around and move, they can fly around. So that's what gives them one of the reasons for their extraordinary success. And of course, in the collections here, we've been accumulating beetle specimens for about 300 years, slightly more than 300 years. I'm just going to show you this that I brought along. This is one drawer of specimens collected by Charles Darwin on the voyages of the Beagle in the 1830s. And when Darwin was a young man, Darwin, of course, who came up with the mechanism of natural selection in the 1850s, when he was a very young man, he got the opportunity to travel on this 5-year circumnavigation of the world. And he stopped all around the South American coast, and everywhere he stopped, he got off the ship. And he didn't like being on the ship very much. He didn't get on that well with the people he was on the ship with, and he got seasick, and he was getting homesick, and he got off onto land, and he just started collecting like mad, and he was collecting everything from fossils and shells to plants. But his particular passion was insects, and his favorite insects were beetles. So he spent a lot of his time as a young man collecting beetles, and he gave to the Natural History Museum 8,000 specimens of beetle from the voyages of the Beagle. So I hope that some of you will come down and have a look afterwards and see some of these, which are original Darwin beetles, some of them labeled in his handwriting. And this is an important thing about a collection like this, is that every single specimen, we've got about 8 million beetles, but every single specimen has got a little label saying who collected it, where it was collected, what it was doing, all of the information to do with the specimen. And what we're doing now at the museum, which is a real breakthrough because no museum has really completed doing this yet, is getting photographs of all of these specimens and all of these labels and making them available on the internet so that people from all over the world can see the information on those labels. And because there's so many specimens and they've been gathered over such a long period of time, nobody's ever read those labels, and so we're discovering things that we didn't know in our own collection, under our own eyes.
So what sorts of things can we find out from studying our collections?
Well, it's amazing the different things you can find out from looking at collections. For example, this piece of wood here. This is a piece of wood that was brought in by a member of the public several years ago by a farmer living in Norfolk in East Anglia. And he was ploughing his field, and he hit against this tree trunk, and he pulled it out and chucked it into his front yard and let it dry out. And then he started cutting it up to put it on the fire. And when he was cutting it up, he found that it had these holes inside, like channels, inside the wood. And inside one of the channels, he found a dead beetle. And the dead beetle is here. So there's some dead beetles that he found inside this piece of wood. And he thought this beetle is obviously able to eat wood. He probably had a nice wooden farmhouse. He didn't really particularly want an insect that could eat wood being around, and he was a bit worried. So he brought it into the Natural History Museum and said, "Is this something I need to be worried about?" And the scientists who were here at the time would have looked at this and they said, "Nope, this is not a British species of beetle." And he said, "Well, it must be, because it's from my farm, and my farm's in Norfolk. So it must be British." And at that point, somebody dated this piece of wood, and this piece of wood is between 3,500 and 5,500 years old. So this has been buried in a field in East Anglia since the Bronze Age. And what would have happened is, before people started coming to Britain and cutting down trees, a lot of the eastern half of England was covered with oak forests. And nowadays, of course, you think of East Anglia and you think of the Norfolk Broads, and these are not very forested areas. There are not a lot of trees, but it was covered with oak forest before people cut them down. And this would have been a tree that was standing at the edge of a swamp. It would have fallen down into the swamp sometime during the winter. And this is a wood-boring kind of beetle that would have been living in the wood, waiting for the spring to fly off into the Bronze Age spring. And it would have drowned in its little cell inside this acidic peaty swamp. And like those people that get preserved in Scandinavian peat bogs, it would have been preserved by the acidic conditions for thousands of years. And so that can tell us something about what the climate was like 5,000 years ago, what the vegetation was like. We can learn something. Because that farmer had the presence of mind to bring in this dead beetle that he found, we can learn something about the climate thousands of years ago and what the world was like for our ancestors. And I'll tell you something else about beetles, which is quite interesting. Does anybody want to guess what these are? There were no eating in the studio, please.
Any guesses, guys?
These are... Shout it out. Animal poos, that's a very good guess.
Very good.
Now, these were originally found by researchers who were looking at the remains of early humans in Africa. You remember recently on Google they had the anniversary of the discovery of Lucy, 41st anniversary of Lucy, and Lucy was one of the early fossils of humans that was found in Africa, a different species of human. And archaeologists and anthropologists who were looking at these fossils were finding these stone balls all the time. And there are scientific papers written about what these stone balls are used for. Maybe it's a weapon or a game or some kind of pot. You can cut the top off and make a pot out of it. But the problem is that these anthropologists were not digging in places where there weren't early humans. They're only digging in places where there were early humans. And of course, if you dig in places where there are no early humans, you'd also find these because they're not made by early humans. These are, in fact, balls of clay. And inside the ball of clay, there's a ball of preserved, in this case, elephant dung. And inside the ball of preserved elephant dung, you know what dung is? Dung is poo, right? Inside the ball of preserved elephant poo, there is an elephant poo beetle. And this is the elephant dung beetle. So this is the beetle that makes the ball of dung. And dung beetles are very, very important because if the female dung beetle is making a ball of dung this size and laying one egg in it, if she wants to lay 200 or 500 eggs or 50 eggs or however many eggs she's going to lay in her life, you can imagine how much dung she's going to have to clear up and bury in order to lay that number of eggs. And if we didn't have dung beetles, the whole place would be covered in poo. So that's actually very important, that we should be very glad that we have dung beetles. And here's a dung beetle. This is a dung beetle from ancient Egypt, and a kind of beetle that's found in ancient Egypt. And they make a ball of dung and they roll it across the desert. And the ancient Egyptians looked at this and they looked at the sun in the sky and they said to each other, there must be a really big dung beetle rolling that across the sky. So they made their dung beetle-headed god, Khepri, who was responsible for rolling the sun out in the morning and rolling it back to bed at night. And that's why when you see ancient Egyptian carvings and tombs of the pharaohs, you see representations of dung beetles, because they were very sacred, because they were involved in rolling out the sun. And inside the mummies of the ancient Egyptians, sometimes they put a stone scarab beetle or dung beetle on the heart of the mummy. So dung beetles are very important, not only culturally, but also for clearing up a lot of mess. And we discovered this when the first European people went to Australia. They brought with them cows and sheep, which come from Africa and Europe, but they didn't bring any dung beetles. And they had a terrible problem with all the dung from these animals and nothing clearing it up. And eventually the Australian government decided it had to solve this problem of flies and disease and the dung covering the green grass that the cows wanted to eat. So they actually brought dung beetles deliberately to Australia in order to clear up the dung from the animals that they'd already brought. So bringing beetles can make a big, big economic difference to some environments. Have we got any questions?
Yes, guys, do we have? Yeah, we've got one over here.
How many beetles did they bring in? They've got a field of dung.
They
how do you
were
measure?
very careful. They were breeding these dung beetles in controlled environments so that they didn't bring any parasites or anything else with them. And they were testing them to make sure that they weren't going to harm the native dung beetles. And, you know, because Australia has a terrible history of bringing over things that it shouldn't have done. And, you know, cane toads and rabbits and all kinds of animals, foxes, have been brought to Australia and have just caused all kinds of problems. So they did this in the 60s and the 50s, and they were already aware of the problems caused by bad choices of introduction in the past. So they bred these in controlled facilities. And they had about 6 or 7 species. And they introduced at specific sites about 400 or 500 individuals of each species. And the ones that took off formed big populations and can now be found all over Australia. But they're only eating the cow and the sheep dung because they were carefully chosen not to go for the kangaroo dung. And kangaroo dung is quite different. You know, it's like eating olives when you want a steak.
Any more questions, guys?
How many beetles are in the world?
How many actual individual beetles? That is a very, very difficult question. I think if you were to answer that question, you'd have to think in terms of tons rather than individuals. It would be more than billions. There are 400,000 different kinds, so far named. Now, in some meadows in England, which is not a very diverse country, they've estimated that there are millions of beetles per square acre. So if you were to extrapolate this across all of the acres of the world, and then you were to multiply that in the tropics, because in tropical forests there's much more than there is in England, you'd come up with an unbelievable number, really, really unbelievable number. It's like saying how much plankton is there in the sea. These things are the bottom of the food chain. Everything eats them. You take away the beetles, all the birds and everything like that is going to start disappearing. So, you know, if you think of a food chain like a pyramid with the biggest bits at the bottom, the beetles are near the bottom, so there are lots. But the interesting thing about beetles is if you change the environment even a little bit, even though there are millions of them, certain species will just disappear. So you'll get a tropical forest where there are millions and millions and millions of beetles, and you can go there and you can collect 30,000 beetles in a week. But if you were to cut down some of the big trees and let the sunlight into the forest floor, you'd find some of these species would just disappear. It doesn't matter how many million they are. If you change the environment too much, they just disappear. So that's what we have to be careful about, is not hurting the environments where these things live too much.
Max, we find beetles all over the world. Is there anywhere that you don't find them?
You don't find them in Antarctica. Not yet. Now, the insects of Antarctica is quite interesting because there are very few insects in Antarctica, and most of them are parasites that live on penguins and seals and things like that. There is only one large free-living insect in Antarctica, which is a wingless fly about 3 millimeters long. So there are no beetles there yet.
Now, Max, you brought along some amazing specimens. I believe you've got the biggest beetle in the world.
Oh, yes, there's a little bit. I can lift this one up. Pop that one out. This is a thing called Titanus giganteus from the tropical forests of northern South America. You get that in Brazil and the Guianas, across into Colombia and Venezuela, and down into Peru and Ecuador. And this is the biggest kind of beetle in the world, and they can get to 17 centimeters long, which is bigger than your hamster. It's like a brown rat. Now, these beetles can fly. There are records of them flying towards a lighted football stadium when Brazilian football teams were trying to play a football match in the evening, and you get something the size of a brown rat flying into the stadium lights and then dropping down into the crowd. And this would no doubt cause some concern amongst football fans. You think, what's that on my head? You know, oh yes, it's a beetle that's larger than my hand. They're not very common, so that doesn't happen very often. But if you were to put a bright light out into the tropical forest, at the right time of year, you might get one or two of these flying in towards the light. Now, before we invented electric light, these were very, very rare and very difficult to collect because we didn't know what they did. But occasionally they fly into the river because they're chasing the reflection of the moon, and they fly into the river and drown, and they get eaten by a fish. And there was a collector in the 1800s, early 1800s, who realized that if you made friends with some of the people who were living alongside the Amazon and eating a lot of fish, if they ever got one of these in the stomach of a fish, then you could buy it from them. Then you could get a reasonable supply of them. And this guy cornered the market in this beetle by buying them from local people who were eating fish. And he was a little bit clever because the males have got big flat feet and the females have got little delicate feet. And this specimen, which is one that is about 150, 200 years old, it's got little delicate foot on its front leg and its back leg, but it's got a big flat foot in its middle leg, which is a little bit odd. And that's because that one was put together out of pieces, out of fish stomachs. And so he's obviously bought a few that have been partially digested, and he's decided to stick them together to make whole beetles so that he could sell them to museums. So a little bit of resourceful collecting there from 100 or 200 years ago. And just for fun, and you'll have to come and look at this later because you can't see it from there, and you probably can't see it from here, we put the smallest beetle in the world in this box as well. And that is 0.3 of a millimeter long.
Now, Max, we're still collecting today, aren't we? Can you tell us a little bit about how you actually collect your beetles?
Well, yes, this is a box of beetles that was collected in Africa, in Tanzania, comparatively recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, by some of my colleagues. And they get up into the mountains in Tanzania where there's no agriculture and there's very little deforestation because the mountains are quite steep and quite inaccessible. And you can put lights out and you can put dung traps out and you can go out with a net and you can find this number of beetles in about 24 hours if you work hard. So in good quality habitat, where we haven't destroyed the place too much, you can still find an awful lot of beetles. And I did bring along an example of the kind of net that we use for collecting beetles. This is a thing called a Malays trap. Would somebody like to hold the other end of this? Just to take that. And that opens up like a tent. And this was discovered by somebody called René Malays, who did a lot of camping. And he realized that when you come back from camping, if you left your tent door open, your tent is full of flies because they fly in through the door and then they go up. And they don't want to go down to where the door is, and so they're just banging on the ceiling. And so he put a bottle at the top that would collect the insects. So the insects fly into the tent and they go up and they end up in the bottle. And then after 24 hours, you go and look in the bottle and there's hundreds of insects inside. And those are only insects that have flown through this little area in a 24-hour period. So you can let go of that now. It shows you how many insects there actually are. And this is quite a good kind of Malays trap because you can haul it up into the canopy of a tree. Oh yeah, and there's me using it in Peru. You can see one of these traps, probably even this one in the background. So we've put this on this dead tree that's fallen down. Because beetles are not just important for decomposing dung and dead animals, they're also really important for decomposing dead wood, like this one from East Anglia. So if you can find a dead tree like that, it's going to be absolutely swarming with beetles. And in a couple of years, the beetles would have eaten it all down to nothing. So if you ever had woodworm in your furniture at home, that's the larva of a beetle. And that's beetles recycling dead wood. They don't recognize that it's your Chippendale chest of drawers that they're recycling. They just think it's a big piece of dead wood and they're going to recycle it.
Now, if we have 22,000 drawers of beetle specimens, why is it important to still keep collecting?
Well, the collection that we have, we aim for it to be as representative a sample of the biodiversity of the Earth as we can get. So it's an archive of biodiversity. If there are 400,000 species, we've got about 220,000 of them represented in the collection here. And that means scientists from all over the world who want to identify their material, they come and use our collection. And so it's a kind of a focus point for scientists from all over the planet. And we want it to be as comprehensive and as useful as possible to the scientific community who's using it. So when new areas are opened up, we want to go in there and we want to study what kind of beetles live there. And we'll probably find new species of beetle. We're still discovering new species. And one of the challenges is to discover the new species before they become extinct, because deforestation and damage to the environment is so widespread. I mean, you know, some of you will have heard that half of Indonesia is on fire at the moment, and the destruction of biodiversity in a fire like that doesn't bear thinking about. And we've had scientists in Indonesia collaborating with Indonesian scientists over the last 15 or 20 years. So we have examples of the specimens that occur in that area, and we know something about what the environment was like before all these fires. And it could be interesting, for example, to go back afterwards and do the same kind of experiments and see whether we find the same species or whether species have been lost as a result of this particular disaster. So you're establishing a baseline of what biodiversity in the world looks like. And when we go back and look at things that were collected in the 19th century, and we go back to the same places today, we do see profound differences. Because human lives are quite short and collection lives are quite long, we actually can't remember what the world was like. You know, you meet very old people and they say this was all green fields and butterflies when I was a lad. And we can't really be sure how much of that is a false memory and how much of that is that the environment has really changed. But if we go to a collection and we look at the labels on the specimens and we look at how many were collected in a day in 1840 compared to how many were collected in a day in 1940 and how many you can find in a day today, we can really learn something. So there's all kinds of reasons to keep on collecting and keep building this database of information.
Yeah, we've got a question here.
Do we know how long ago it was, how many millions of years ago, when the insects and beetles as an insect first emerged?
First appeared. Yes, I think we've got a geological timescale on here, Alison, you may have. But the earliest beetles are between 300 and 400 million years ago, which is more or less close to the beginning of life on land. They're older than the dinosaurs. They're older than the coal-forming and oil-forming swamps. And of course, if you go back to the Carboniferous or some of those very warm times, there was a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. It's when all the coal and oil was being laid down. And the insects were a lot larger than they are today. So you got big dragonflies like this sort of size and things like that. And probably there were also very big beetles, though we haven't found any fossils. Beetles don't fossilize very well.
We have another question.
I think they have quite short lives and often don't live in very, very large numbers.
When they're rolling, the things, do they releasing any chemical, the things to stick the waste?
Sorry?
When they are rolling, the animal poos or
The animal poos, yes.
Do they release any, the chemical or something, or just by rolling it and compressing it, to making them hard and the things, or do they?
They don't put any chemical in it. The only thing they put inside is their egg. But they roll it to get it away from the ball of dung. Because dung is actually quite a rare resource in the environment. If you think how many elephants there are in Africa and how often they produce dung, when they drop a pile of dung in the middle of the savannah, it's a bit like somebody dropping a bag of money in the middle of the high street. Everybody wants to rush in and grab as much as they can carry because it's not going to be there for very long and everybody wants a bit. So they roll a ball and take it away to stop that dung from being stolen by other dung beetles from them. And they do steal it from each other. So that's why they roll it and push it away, is to stop other people from stealing it. Do they smell? They have a sense of smell, or do they smell to us? No, do they have a sense of? Yeah, they have these antennae, which are very sensitive. So it's not like our sense of smell at all. It's a completely different sense. But it allows them to detect dung long, long distances away.
So we have another question here.
Are there any poisonous beetles?
You know, if you were to eat enough of your ordinary, beautiful seven-spot ladybird, you'll get quite sick. Because the reason that ladybird is red and black like that is to show birds that it's not nice to eat. So if you're a bird and you eat a ladybird and then you get a bit sick, you remember that red and black color. That's something nasty. And next time you see it, You think, I better not eat that. And that's why ladybirds can afford to wander around looking brightly colored, because all of the birds don't want to eat it because they've tried one and that's enough. And so ladybirds are a little bit poisonous, but only if you eat them. They won't bite you. And you'd have to eat probably a good-sized cup full of ladybirds before you actually got ill, so just don't do that. There are not beetles that sting you, like bees and wasps and some flies and things. They don't actually come and find you and bite you, but some of them, if you eat them, then you will get a bit sick.
What's the biggest type of beetle?
The biggest kind of beetle is this one. And the biggest one of all of these is about 17 centimeters long. That lives in South America. Probably the weevils, which is the one that we, those are beetles that have a long nose. And there are probably about 70,000 different kinds of weevils alone. So it's just one kind of beetle with.
Do beetles poo?
Oh, they do, yes. And there are dung beetles that feed on beetle dung too. So the big beetles do their poo and the other little beetles go and clean it up. So nothing gets wasted in nature.
Do dung beetles poo?
They also do.
Then do they clean up their own poo?
Different ones do it. Different ones do it. So yeah, they don't want to eat something which is already, they've already taken everything they want out of that, so they don't want that anymore. But compared to a dung beetle, the digestion of a big cow or a buffalo or an elephant or something is quite wasteful, so there's still lots of goodness left in there for them, but once they've eaten it once, they don't want to eat it a second time. Somebody else can do that.
Now, guys, I know we've got lots and lots of questions, but we are running out of time. And I'm just really keen that you guys have a closer look at these specimens here. You have a chance to come down to the front. So we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed your Nature Live. If you did, do come back and see us again. We do run these every Friday, Saturday and Sunday, and a different topic every day as well. So do come again. And if you please all join me in thanking Max for speaking to us.